Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Phillips, Director of JL Phillips Gallery in Toronto, Canada. I'm joined today with my colleague and good friend, Chris Boylan in Sydney, Australia. Today, we're so excited to talk to you about our latest publication, Man Who Cannot Die, Phantom Shields of the New Guinea Highlands, highlighting something that's near and dear to our hearts, phantom shields. Over the past 4 years, we've had the opportunity to work with a team of experts, including Bruce Cree, Jonathan Fogel, Hubert Langman, and Kevin Patrick. And if you have any questions or would like to order the book, all the information will be at the end of the video. Please make sure to check out Travel Art London 2021. So let's hear from Chris and start off with the history of Waki Valley.
Hi, I'm based in Australia, but for over 40 years, I've traveled to many different corners of the Pacific. But I must say, of all the places I've been, the most fascinating, the most interesting for me has been the New Guinea Highlands. The New Guinea Highlands was isolated from the rest of the world for over 30,000 years. And during this time, they did develop their own sophisticated culture. There are over 1 million people living in this connection of valleys that went from one end of the highlands to the other. Then in 1933, the outside world arrived in the context of some gold prospectors, an Australian colonial administrator coming with them, and they were astounded to find valleys that were fertile, highly populated, and unknown to the rest of the world. It was one of those great discoveries, probably the last great group of people to be discovered in the history of the world. And compare this to what was happening elsewhere in the world, in the Nile Valley in Egypt and Mesopotamia. About the same time, they were doing very similar things. What differed with New Guinea, they were cut off, and all the movements of civilization that happened over the centuries never affected them. So fundamentally, they remained a Stone Age culture. Stone Age on one level, technologically, but culturally incredibly sophisticated. The largest and most fertile of the valleys is the Waki Valley in central New Guinea. And this will be the focus of our story. When the outside world first arrived, the Papua New Guinea Highlanders had like I said before, a very sophisticated society, but part of that was also endemic warfare. The Highlanders basically loved to fight, and wars were going on all the time. Here is an early photo taken in 1936 by Mick Lay, one of the first people to arrive in the Highlands, that shows a mock battle, but essentially how the Highlanders would have fought each other, very close to each other, carrying shields with spears and bows and arrows. In the Highlands, development really came quite late. Even though the first whites to enter was 1933, the war happened soon after, and the Japanese occupied the northern shores of New Guinea. So in reality, development really didn't take place till the late 40s, the early 50s. And in this sense, the administration, as it was, and not the colonial administration, it was under the auspices of the United Nations. It was what was termed a trust territory. The Australian administration wanted to do two major things. One was to stop warfare, and they're very harsh on this. They suppressed warfare almost entirely. And the second was education, to begin to bring the Highlanders up to the same level of education that the coastal people had. Okay, moving along, Papua New Guinea slowly developed. Independence came in 1975. Shortly after this, with the relaxation of what I would say very strong suppression of warfare by the Australian administration, warfare began to reassert itself in the Highlands. People brought out old shields that had been hidden. They began to carve new shields. And initially, the motifs on the shields were very traditional. And here's a couple of the types of shields that the people would have used traditionally, and also in these early days of war reassertion. You can see the first one is a very strong circular design painted in reds and blues. And the second shield, bright yellow colors. Now, soon after independence, we'd say the first generation of Highland people who'd been educated were beginning to reach the age of warriors. And combined with their education, they slowly decided to bring new motifs into their shields. They could write on them, for instance. They could bring commercial aspects of life onto their shields. Football was a great innovation that the colonial administration had brought in. So there were football competitions that were painted on shields. Beer was something that people painted on the shields, because in some cases, of course, beer and drunkenness would have caused fights. So there was a connection between the two. In the 1980s, these designs even started to dominate the shield decorations of the New Guinea Highlanders. It was an anthropologist from the British Museum, Mike O'Hanlon, collected quite a lot of these in the 1980s. They're now in the British Museum. And these displayed Cambridge Cup, for example. That was a football competition. They had 6 to 6. That was an assertion that we fight from 6 in the morning till 6 at night. But also there was a hidden meaning behind it, that we also drink beer from 6 at night till 6 in the morning. So that it was a very, what I would say, educated response to new motifs on the shields. And through this period of what I would say education of the first generation of New Guinea Highlanders, one thing that came into the Highlands and available to people were the phantom comics and comic strips printed in local newspapers. So these young boys of the 1970s grew up having access to the phantom comics. So when by the 1980s they became warriors, what better to bring forward onto his shields than the famous phantom?
The Phantom first appeared in February 1936 and was created by Lee Falk. He was one part of the pulp comic figures that was popular in the early 19th century and into the 1950s. The Phantom was truly one that was a transitional from pulp into classic comic books. So where did he come from and how did he get across the world? He was based in the US, as Lee Falk was, but as his story goes, his origins began in the 16th century when his ship was traveling along with his father along the coast of Africa. It was marooned by pirates and they ended up on the shores of Bengalan, and Christopher Walker was set alone to avenge his father's death, in which he famously swore on the top of his skull, "I swear to devote my life to the destruction of all forms of piracy, greed, and cruelty, injustice. My sons and my sons' sons shall follow me." This is very important to point out in its connections to Waki Valley and the Highlands belief system, that this part of not only the ancestors' spirits, which were very important to appease and keep calm within the realm, but also the ancestral lineage. The Phantom was human, and so his sons did inherit his line in this whole avengement of good and evil. There were a total of 22 different phantoms over its lifespan. And the Phantom was published across the world, namely places such as, of course, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Turkey, Scandinavia, India, and Germany. But how did it end up in the Highlands? So interestingly enough, the Phantom was first seen in the Women's Mirror in Australia in 1936 when it was first published. The main character, Diana Palmer, was constantly being saved by the Phantom character. During this time, and as it began to get more popular within Australia, it was picked up and brought over into Papua New Guinea. In the Highlands, in 1973, it was published in Wontok to help promote literacy and education. And there he was born, in part, especially from his embrace and his culture of embodying the best and strong against evil. This really was taken by the Waki culture and spoke to them enough that they would hire new educated artists that could paint these wonderful characters on them.
So the Phantom character became iconic in the Highlands. The first recorded painting of the Phantom in public was on the band's post office in the Waki Valley in 1986. It was photographed by Mike O'Hanlon during his studies there. And it would appear that shortly around this time or shortly after this, the idea of putting the Phantom onto the shields would have come into play. Now, the people who painted the Phantom were not the shield makers themselves, but this job was given to a new class of Highlander who was an advertiser, who painted signs for people, who painted designs on trucks. And they would come to these sign writers and say, please put a design on my shield for me, something new, something fresh. And there were certain of these sign writers who from their childhood probably read the Phantom comics and said, I'm going to put the Phantom on your shield. And the first of these was probably a character called Capel Carr. There was a good friend of Mike O'Hanlon from the British Museum. And here's a photograph of him actually painting one of the shields in the early 90s. Many of the early shields were really quite simple, often with just a head of the Phantom and the traditional designs of the shield splaying out from the head, because it was very much a time when both tradition and new ideas were combined together. As the years rolled on, the designs, the motifs on the shields depicting the Phantom actually became more and more complex. And Capel Carr was one of these characters who, if you look at the development of his work, it did become more and more complex. He introduced new ideas, probably directly out of the Phantom comic. Another artist who is still alive and working is John Waki. I first met John in 2008, 2009, and collected several Phantom shields from him. He had no connection with Capel Carr or some of the people further up the Waki Valley, but he just said to me, I love the Phantom, and this is why I painted the Phantom on the shields. Now, these early shields were used in fighting, but as time went on, guns were introduced into New Guinea Highlands warfare, and the wooden shields virtually became obsolete. What happened at this point, people like Capel Carr, who had connections with people from outside the country, realized that here was a chance to be thought of as artists in the true sense. And this is when I think the creation of Papua New Guinea artists like Capel Carr, like John Waki, really came to the fore. They creatively developed an amazing contemporary art movement in the New Guinea Highlands. And this is amazing, you know, suddenly 30 or 40 years after contact, that the greatest art movement of the New Guinea Highlands, of New Guinea, sorry, would develop in the Highlands itself. Why paint the Phantom? This is something Jessica's talked about. There were three basic reasons. One was his connection with the ancestors. It was so important to cosmology of the New Guinea Highlanders. The second was he lived in the Skull Cave up in the mountains, and this is exactly where the spirits of the dead travel to. So there's always this connection with the ancestors. Number three was the words that were put on, Phantom, of course, but then Man Who Never Dies, sometimes written in English, sometimes in Pidgin. And various other things could be written on the shield. So at some point in the history of the Phantom shields, there was a movement from shields painted purely for warfare to an art movement where they're actually sold to people outside the country. And the distinction is not clear, and perhaps that distinction is not important.
Chris, I agree with you that the relevance of fighting shields or not, especially given the age of the shields that they were either repurposed for sale or used, are still old. There's a beautiful part of this in what collectors look at, that this cross-cultural bridge has happened from classic ethnographic art into contemporary art celebrated by the Waki artists. And that's something that many collectors, as well as museums around the world, have acknowledged. The term pop tribal was deemed by art historian N.F. Carlins back in the 2000s. And it's a perfect example to look at these in that way. Since my first encounter with these shields back in the early 2000s, I was shown by Billy Jameson in Toronto. He had 4 in the collection. And my young self, who was obsessed with comic books like X-Men and Batman as a kid, they really spoke to me. They just brought a big smile to my face. And although I wasn't very familiar with the Phantom character, being a superhero, I wanted to know more. This was also at the time when I was first introduced into involvement in ethnographic art. And so for my own self, this was a complete bridge into learning about one thing while celebrating something that I already collected, and that was comic books. The lore behind it and the romanticized story that I was told once upon a time was the old GIs fighting and hanging out in Wagi Valley, being sent Phantom comic books from their sweethearts. As we know, and what we go over in the book as well, this is completely false. But I believe that the actual story is even better and much more celebrated. Once again, when you look at what these artists were able to accomplish in different styles, in shadow work, line work, and also an abstract contemporary outlook using color blocks and commercial paint, these embossments that show the old patterns found on the shields and keeping the rattan along the top. These details combined really make it not only a center point in anyone's collection, but also a great conversation to discuss the globalization around the world within ethnographic cultures. For myself, I've been privy to well over 21 plus in collections. In Toronto alone, there are over 20 plus. Speaking to collectors, I always like to ask them what brought them to bringing this into their collection, especially those that collect contemporary art. And it is that, stance of obscurity, of curiosity, and also artistry, that they can really understand that there is much more than just an image painted upon wood, that there's meaning behind this. And every light, every shine, every emblem placed, whether it be from a Toyota Land Cruiser or a license plate, to those that had these shields, it also meant something to them, just as it did and it will again. That's something that I also think is very important with celebrating these shields. Not only are they found in private collections, we also find them in museums, such as the Art Gallery of South Wales, South Australian Museum in Adelaide, the National Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarea, the University of British Columbia, Pitt Rivers, which I've seen in person, and it is just flooring when you walk in and see the 4 across in the rafters. It's phenomenal. There's also in Musée des Confluences in Lyon, France, as well as Musée d'Art des Histoires en Roquefort-en-sur-Mer en France. These collections and museums have recognized the connection between the classic and historical ethnographic art and how they have been able to continue in this art form into the modern time. What we'd like to do now is show you a few shields we'd like to highlight that are published in the book that we think you would enjoy. The first one is from the Toby Wannick and related work group, Group H. And Chris, what do you like about this shield?
Jessica, there's no such thing as a favorite shield, but I have to say this is one of my favorite. There's probably 4 things I really love about this shield. The first would be that it's an older original shield. If you look below the painted surface, there's the punctating is there, which is the central circle, the radiating lines. Along the top, there are holes where the original weaving would have gone through. That's the first. The second is there's a combination of old and new in this shield that I really love. That the Phantom has been painted over all of this. I think probably the whole shield was painted white first, then the Phantom was put on, then some of the original designs were actually picked out and painted on. I like that. The third thing I really love is the movement. The Phantom is running, and if you can imagine, I can imagine this being held in the war. The Phantom is actually running towards the enemy, hopefully to frighten them. And the last thing is the wording, because the Phantom is often written on the top of the shields, but at the bottom of the shield, man who never dies is another important aspect that the Highlanders loved about the Phantom.
Truly a beautiful shield, and I do enjoy the movement as well, with the Phantom holding his pistols, which are his signature gun. I'd also really love how the old pattern is incorporated into the movement, that it almost looks like tunnel vision coming out at you. Yeah, this is truly it's a great shield. This one, which is part of the Kapelka band style group, in Group B, is near and dear to my heart as well. I did used to live with this one, and it was my favorite of Billy's collection. What I love about it is, as well, you can see this old shield, and it's like a shadow of the angular triangle coming from the back. The rattan is still present at the top. And there's this wonderful metal piece that's sort of in the middle that really held the handle on, which in my eyes just showed that it would have been used as well. The one thing I'd like to point out is the eyes, and that they've been painted red. Predominantly, the Phantom eyes are white. Falk did this to make it more of a mystery, and was really modeled after old Roman busts, and this sort of gave this magical allure to his eyes. These ones are red, and so it makes me think that this was a very ferocious fighter. He also has this cascade of skulls surrounding him, showing that is the mark that he would have on his right hand, on the ring of his skull of his enemies. So the Phantom always carried 2 rings on his hands, one with the skull and one with the sign of peace. Those that he would protect would have the left hand, while the right would be the skull. And that makes me really feel like this was a true warrior's shield that had this commissioned.
I agree with you, Jessica. This shield has almost certainly been used in warfare. There's one thing the Highlanders did early on was cover that cane connection to the carrying strap with metal, in case an enemy would slash the cane and the shield would drop down and expose the warrior to arrows and possibly death. A couple of other things I love about the shield are, as you pointed out, the original design is underneath, almost blackened with smoke, but then they've put some of their traditional design on top again, the triangles at the top, the dotted line across the center. And I've seen that often this is as important as the Phantom itself, that they love to combine the traditional with the new, and both are important to them. And the other connection of the skull, of course, is to the skull cave up in the mountains, to the ancestors. all those things on different levels make this a very special shield. We'd really like to have a look at two quite different shields. We discussed earlier the fact that the earlier shields were actually used in warfare. Later on, they developed into more an art form. And we've got two shields here, which cover both angles. The first one, as you can see here, was collected in 1994. It's a very strong figure of the phantom in the center. He's surrounded by some of the traditional design, but there is writing, a lot of writing on it. And I find this very, very interesting, referring to a civil war in 1989. And it's interesting because that year, according to a local researcher, was the first year that guns were used in battle. So at this point, wooden shields were still definitely used in fighting.
Chris, I do really love the layout of this one. And I have to say the hands and the positioning really speak to me. There's a lot of detail and artistry within just the hands alone, and the positioning of how the white detailing of paint wraps up and sort of again brings this sort of mysticism, and the two floating phantom heads. I could sort of see that he has eyes everywhere, which is one of the old jungle sayings as well. The layering of paint on this is phenomenal. And you can see the scratches and the exterior that's been worked on and probably repainted at times as well. Yeah, this is truly a very alluring, and I could see this, used in battle, that it would be quite intimidating. And especially the muted colors, which you find in the older shields.
The next shield we're going to look at is one that is, in comparison to the previous one, so sophisticated, so beautifully painted, that it can only be a more modern shield. It was collected in 2008. The phantom is standing very strongly with the gun. The skull cave is behind him. And what we see here is vegetation actually appearing in beautiful greens around the figure. And I suspect this shield of the phantom was very much connected to someone looking at a comic and copying some aspect of the phantom directly from a comic.
I completely agree, Chris, especially with the image of skull cave looming behind him. That is very stylistic of comic book layouts, as well as that detail of the smoking gun. Their line work in this is just phenomenal. And I truly like when you say the foliage, like there are parts in the trees that I've just gotten lost to staring in, where you can see just even the small leaf work. And I love that part, that the artist has really, that shows a lot of study as well in landscape painting. The other part that I love is that there are 3 different fonts used. There are 3 in this, with "Man Save No Die" on the bottom, and the phantom in these beautiful bubble letters with this shadow work. It has such a popular culture and comic book vibe to it, that it clearly was something that was commissioned, that someone said they really understood what it was, and they understood the assignment, and they understood also landscape painting, which is something that again was very new but celebrated in this work. And just the colors alone, when you look at again these muted colors from the beginning, and how they were integrated more and studied into the later years, that's a great comparison to see, and still both so powerful. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and check out manwhocannotdie.com to order the book.